When I was younger, I wrote a bunch of things about. I wrote a song called "There's an Old Man in Our Town." It was about my grandfather sitting on the porch, and he was kind of senile. And I think that was good for me to write that, because now I'm going to go sit on the porch myself.
Kenny Rogers, the man whose voice could make you smile through tears. He sold over 100 million records, lit up stages across the world, and gave us songs that still play in our heads decades later. But behind the smooth voice and white beard was a life filled with struggle, heartbreak, and battles the public never saw. From a childhood in poverty, to love stories that ended in regret, to a quiet fight against illness far from the spotlight. This is the untold journey of Kenny Rogers, and the bittersweet truth about how it ended. Kenny Rogers wasn't born into comfort or privilege. Far from it. He came into the world on August 21st, 1938, in Houston, Texas, the fourth of 8 children in a family that barely scraped by. His mother, Lucille, worked as a nurse's assistant. His father, Edward, was a carpenter who could never seem to get steady work. They lived in a government housing project built for white families, homes that replaced ones belonging to families of color. And while the rent was cheap, life was hard. Kenny would later say they were nutritionally deprived, more often than not. Some nights, dinner was just peanut butter on bread because that's all there was. But he didn't complain. To him, that was normal. From a young age, Kenny learned the value of work. He swept floors in a hat shop for $9 a week. He bussed tables at the Rice Hotel. He even won a local talent show at the Texan Theater, a hint that music might be his ticket out. But Houston's 4th Ward wasn't a place where dreams came easy. It was rough, and trouble was always close. His brother Roy once said, "We were poor, there's no doubt about that." His sister Sandy added, "We struggled, but we had faith." That faith, and the kindness of the people around them, stuck with Kenny for life. Decades later, after he'd made it big, he learned that a neighbor who had once helped his family was in trouble. Her car was broken down and she couldn't afford to fix it. She needed $600. Kenny didn't just send the money. He sent $20,000 in a note that read, "Thank you for helping me pay my rent years ago." It wasn't about charity. It was about remembering exactly where he came from. And that empathy, shaped by poverty, struggle, and gratitude, would follow him into every stage of his career. But some of his deepest wounds came from someone much closer, his own father. Some scars aren't visible, and for Kenny Rogers, one of the deepest came from his own father. Edward Floyd Rogers had been a carpenter, a man who worked with his hands and carried himself with quiet pride. But after World War II, jobs in Houston were unpredictable. Paychecks were small, bills were big, and hope had a way of fading fast. Somewhere in that struggle, alcohol became his way of coping. Kenny was just a boy watching this unfold, watching a man he admired slowly slip behind a wall he couldn't break through. In later years, he'd admit he never took a single drink, not because of moral high ground, but out of fear. "I didn't want to risk becoming my father," he'd say. He knew addiction could run in families, and he wasn't willing to test his luck. But avoiding alcohol didn't erase the ache of not understanding him. Edward rarely talked about his feelings, never explained why he drank, and by the time Kenny learned the truth, it was too late. In his memoir, Luck or Something Like It, Kenny wrote about finally realizing the crushing weight his father had carried, the shame of not being able to provide for his wife and 8 children, the quiet despair of watching other men succeed where he could not. "It breaks my heart that I didn't know that before he passed away," Kenny confessed. That single sentence carried decades of regret. And yet, instead of letting that pain turn into resentment, Kenny used it as a tool for empathy. He never judged people battling addiction. He'd seen it too closely, understood the loneliness it carried. That compassion seeped into his music, his friendships, even the way he handled conflict. He wasn't quick to condemn. He was quick to listen. It also pushed him toward creativity outside of music. Photography became one of his escapes, a way to focus his mind between tours, to create something beautiful from stillness. In those quiet moments, maybe he was trying to find what his father never could: peace. But even as he found pieces of himself in art, there was something else pulling at him. the dream that had been sitting in his heart since that small-town talent show. And to chase it, Kenny would have to risk failure more than once. And risk it he did. Through false starts, wrong turns, and one psychedelic song that would change everything. Kenny Rogers didn't take the straight path to stardom. He took the scenic route, with a few dead ends along the way. His first taste of the spotlight came in 1957, with a rockabilly single called That Crazy Feeling. It got some local attention, even earned him a TV appearance. But just as quickly as the buzz started, it fizzled out. Kenny didn't pack it in. Instead, he shifted gears and joined a jazz trio, the Bobby Doyle Three. The group had talent, smooth harmonies, dedicated fans, and they landed a deal with Columbia Records. For a while, it looked like they might be going somewhere, but by 1965, the group dissolved. Kenny gave solo work another shot with a melancholy track called Here's That Rainy Day in 1966. It sank without a trace. If most people had been in his shoes by then, they might have decided music wasn't worth the fight. But Kenny was stubborn, in the best possible way. That same year, he joined the New Christie Minstrels, a folk group with an upbeat, clean-cut image. It wasn't a perfect fit. Kenny wasn't a background guy, not for long. Within a year, he and 3 other members, Mike Settle, Terry Williams, and Thelma Camacho, broke away to form something new. The First Edition. This time, lightning struck. Their 1968 hit, Just Dropped In, To See What Condition My Condition Was In, was psychedelic, trippy, and completely unexpected from a guy who would one day be country music royalty. The song's gritty tone and Kenny's deep voice made it unforgettable. Decades later, it would even find new life in the cult classic film The Big Lebowski. As the years went on, the First Edition leaned more into country rock, with tracks like Ruby, Don't Take Your Love to Town, and Reuben James. Kenny became the clear frontman. But by the mid-70s, the group had run its course. The breakup left Kenny at a crossroads, and in the music industry, being a solo artist in your late 30s was considered a liability. Record labels told him straight, too old for country music. That rejection stung, but it also lit a fire. Kenny took gigs wherever he could, including a small Las Vegas lounge with just 600 seats. One night, the venue's booker, Steve Wynn, pulled him aside. Instead of offering him more work, Wynn told him he was firing him, not for lack of talent, but because Kenny was too good for this place. He told him to aim higher. That push led to a collaboration with producer Larry Butler. Together, they recorded Lucille, a song that would transform Kenny's career. It wasn't just a hit, it was a phenomenon. It topped charts worldwide, won him a Grammy, and gave him the momentum he'd been chasing for nearly 2 decades. And just like that, Kenny Rogers wasn't fighting to be heard anymore. Now, everyone was listening, but success wasn't the finish line. It was the beginning of a run that would blur the lines between country, pop, and pure storytelling. Once Lucille hit the airwaves, Kenny Rogers stopped being just another country singer. He became a voice you couldn't escape, and didn't want to. The late 70s and early 80s were his golden stretch. He had more than 60 top 40 hits across multiple charts. He could release a heartbreak ballad one month and a pop anthem the next, and both would climb to number 1. In 1978, The Gambler didn't just top the country charts, it became his signature song. The story of a late-night train ride, a mysterious card player, and a life lesson tucked inside a poker metaphor was so vivid that it practically begged for a visual. And it got one. The Gambler turned into a TV movie in 1980, with Kenny playing the title role. It was a hit. So much so that it spawned an entire series of sequels, racking up Emmy nominations along the way. Then came Lady, a silky ballad written by Lionel Richie that blurred the line between country and pop so perfectly that it topped the Billboard Hot 100, the country chart, and the R&B chart, all at once. It was proof that Kenny's voice could live anywhere. And of course, there was Islands in the Stream with Dolly Parton. The duet so natural, so filled with chemistry, that for decades fans insisted they had to be more than friends. Kenny laughed that off. They weren't lovers, just 2 people with matching work ethics, shared childhood struggles, and a deep understanding of each other. Kenny wasn't content to just make music. He dipped into acting with roles in films like Six Pack and TV shows like McShane. He also stepped into business, co-founding Kenny Rogers Roasters with former KFC CEO John Y. Brown Jr. The rotisserie chicken chain never quite conquered America, but it found surprising success overseas. By the mid-'80s, Kenny was more than an artist. He was a brand. In 1986, fans voted him favorite singer of all time in a joint USA Today and People magazine poll. His albums The Gambler and Kenny were later listed among the 200 most influential country albums in history. He was everywhere, on the radio, the TV screen, in commercials and restaurants. But what fans didn't see was that even at the height of his fame, Kenny was carrying the weight of personal losses and heartbreaks. And one of those heartbreaks came in 1991, when Kenny lost not just a collaborator, but one of the truest friends he'd ever had. For Kenny Rogers, some of the most powerful partnerships weren't business deals or chart-topping collaborations. They were friendships. And one of the most important was with Dottie West. On stage, their chemistry was undeniable. Together, they recorded hits like Every Time Two Fools Collide and Anyone Who Isn't Me Tonight, songs that blended heartache and hope in a way fans couldn't get enough of. Offstage, they were even closer. Kenny stood by her during some of her toughest years, after her divorce, after her bankruptcy, when she was trying to rebuild. One gesture summed it up. Dottie needed a reliable car, so Kenny gave her one. Not a loan, a gift. She was still driving that same car on August 31st, 1991, when she set out for a performance at the Grand Ole Opry. The car broke down. In a rush to make it to the show, she called a neighbor to pick her up. They sped toward the venue, but on the freeway, something went wrong. The car lost control, slammed into a divider, and Dottie was left with devastating injuries. She fought. She went through multiple surgeries, but just days later, she was gone. For Kenny, it wasn't just the loss of a duet partner, it was losing family. Years later, he still talked about her with the same warmth, the same sadness, the same desire to see her honored. He pushed for her to be inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame, calling it one of his biggest goals. And in 2018, that wish came true. When the news broke, Kenny posted a short but heartfelt message. "Congratulations to my friend, the late, very great Dottie West." It was his way of making sure the world didn't forget her. But Dottie's passing wasn't the only time Kenny had to fight for what mattered. Years later, he'd find himself in a different kind of battle. Not for a person, but for something he believed was rightfully his. And this time, the fight would be against one of the biggest forces in the music industry. After decades of bright lights and roaring crowds, Kenny Rogers found a very different kind of comfort on a quiet patch of land in Colbert, Georgia. His estate, Beaver Dam Farms, was sprawling, serene, and about as far from the chaos of touring life as you could get. And among the horses, rolling fields, and quiet mornings, there was one very unusual resident, a goat named Smitty. Kenny got Smitty in 2008 from a friend, thinking it would just be a fun addition to the farm. But Smitty became much more than that. In interviews, Kenny called him my center, the one constant that helped him stay grounded after months on the road. It was a bond only Kenny could explain. After spending years performing to tens of thousands of fans, coming home to one small creature who didn't care about record sales or Grammy Awards was grounding. Smitty didn't need autographs, just food, space to roam, and the occasional scratch behind the ears. For a man whose life had been built on noise, applause, interviews, deadlines, this quiet companionship was priceless. It gave him something simple to look forward to after the endless cycle of hotels and airports. But while Smitty brought peace, Kenny's personal life was far from quiet. His journey in love had been long, complicated, and filled with regrets he was never afraid to admit. And it would take 5 marriages, public scrutiny, and a few painful lessons before Kenny found the kind of love he could hold on to. Kenny Rogers sang about love better than almost anyone. But living it was another story. Over his lifetime, he was married 5 times, and each relationship left its mark. His first marriage was to Janice Gordon in 1958, and just like his music career at the time, it started fast. They had a daughter, Carol Lynn, But by 1960, the marriage was over. Only months later, he married Jean Rogers, a union that lasted just 3 years. In 1964, Kenny tried again with Margot Anderson. They had a son, but by 1975, the marriage had unraveled. 2 years later, in 1977, he wed actress Marianne Gordon. For 16 years, they seemed like one of country music's most solid couples. But even that relationship came to an end in 1993. And it wasn't just emotional. Marianne's divorce settlement was rumored to be around $60 million. Finally, in 1997, Kenny married Wanda Miller, the woman who would be with him for the rest of his life. Wanda was 28 years younger than Kenny, something that raised eyebrows, especially with her parents, who were just 2 years younger than Kenny himself. At first, they didn't approve, but over time, they came to see what Kenny already knew. She was his soulmate. In his autobiography, Luck or Something Like It, Kenny didn't sugarcoat the truth about his failed marriages. "Every woman I married, I really loved when I married her," he wrote, "but I was so driven and selfish, so intent on following my life that it cost me." Wanda gave him something the others couldn't, a sense of peace. Together they had twin boys, and for the first time, Kenny seemed settled. But that happiness came with a shadow. He was already in his late 60s when his sons were born. And for a man who had spent decades on the road, the idea of being an older father carried its own kind of heartbreak. Kenny Rogers knew how to bet on a song, but in business, not every gamble paid off. In 1991, he teamed up with former KFC CEO John Y. Brown Jr. to launch Kenny Rogers Roasters, a rotisserie chicken chain built on the promise of a healthier alternative to fried fast food. It started strong. The food got good reviews, the name carried star power, and a shout-out on Seinfeld turned it into a pop culture reference. The plan was to make it a nationwide staple. But within a year, trouble hit. A smaller restaurant company claimed the Roasters concept had been copied and filed a $10 million lawsuit. Kenny's team ended up buying out the smaller brand to settle things. But by then, competition from bigger fast food chains had already cut into their momentum. By 1998, Kenny Rogers Roasters in the US had gone bankrupt. Kenny quietly stepped away from the brand. Ironically, it found a second life overseas. Today, there are still hundreds of Roasters locations in Southeast Asia, where it's wildly popular. It was a reminder that even the most successful artist could take hits outside the music world. But unlike a bad business deal, there was one setback Kenny couldn't recover from: the decline of his health and the sudden end to his farewell tour. And when the tour stopped, the rumors started, until Kenny himself had to speak up. For Kenny Rogers' sister Sandy, losing him wasn't just losing a brother. It was losing a piece of her own story. In the year after his passing, she spoke about him with a mix of disbelief and deep affection, remembering the man behind the music. Kenny Rogers left the world quietly, but his songs never stopped playing. In bars, in cars, in family kitchens where someone might still be drinking milk from the jug. He was more than a chart topper, more than a brand. He was a storyteller who never forgot where he came from, and whose voice still has the power to stop you in your tracks. So which Kenny Rogers song still stays with you? Let us know. And maybe, just maybe, someone else will hear it for the first time and fall in love with that voice all over again.